Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Tonight's conversation is going to center on one of the most consequential and I think often overlooked pieces of immigration policy, and that is its impact on children. The systems and laws in place impact children in ways such as where they live, if families stay together, what safety and stability look like in their everyday lives. So tonight we are so fortunate to welcome Linda Corchado from Kids in Need of Defense, acronym KIND. Linda Corchado is the Vice President and of State and Local Advocacy at Kids in Need of Defense. She most recently served as Senior Director of Immigration at Children at Risk, where she led advocacy efforts to improve outcomes for children of immigrants and families. An attorney from El Paso, Texas, Linda has been at the forefront of key legal battles on the border, from challenging family separation under zero tolerance to pushing for the end of expulsions, unaccompanied minors, and reform of the immigration court system. Previously, Linda directed legal services at Las Americas Immigration Advocacy Center. Her advocacy has been featured in publications from The New Yorker, The Los Angeles Times, to El Paso Matters. She earned her BA in Political Science and Latin American Studies at Swarthmore College and her JD at Cardozo School of Law in New York City. Linda lives in El Paso and is the proud daughter of Mexican immigrants who worked the fields of California in the 1960s before becoming restaurant owners in El Paso. So please help me in welcoming tonight Linda Corchada. Linda, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for hosting me. And it's nice that you're all here in the evenings too. So thanks for joining us and your interest in this topic. So let me get started with our presentation. And so I'll give an overview. I'm hoping you can, here, I'll minimize that too. Does everyone have a good view?
Yes. It looks great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for being here. As Shauna mentioned, I'm Linda Corchado, the VP for State and Local Advocacy at KIND. Today, I'll share what unaccompanied children are facing right now, how policy shifts are putting them in harm's way, and concrete steps state and local leaders can take to protect kids. Here's an overview of my presentation for today. This conversation comes at a moment when longstanding safeguards for unaccompanied children are being dismantled under the second Trump administration. We'll start with who KIND is and the journey unaccompanied children take. Then I'll walk through 25 through 26 policy changes that are undermining longstanding child protection safeguards and close with community level actions you can take now. Here at KIND, our vision is a world in which children's rights and well-being are protected as they migrate alone in search of safety. Our mission is simple, ensuring that no child appears in immigration court without high-quality legal representation, advancing laws, policies, and practices that ensure children's protection and uphold their right to due process and fundamental fairness. And finally, promoting in countries of origin, transit, and destination durable solutions to child migration that are grounded in the best interests of the child and ensure that no child is forced to involuntarily migrate. Here at KIND, we have 4 key programs. KIND works in the US, Mexico, and Europe to protect unaccompanied children and refugee children as they migrate in search of safety. We provide and support direct and pro bono legal representation for children in immigration proceedings and work holistically through psychosocial programming to help kids process trauma and connect to vital services. I serve on our policy team where we educate and advocate to advance safeguards for unaccompanied children. KIND also engages in impact litigation. One of our founding principles is that no child should appear in court alone. Importantly, immigration judges are 100 times more likely to grant legal relief for unaccompanied children with counsel than to those without. Without a fair chance to make their case, children who need and deserve protection can be sent back to grave harm. Here's an overview of our offices across the world. As you see, we're situated in Europe, the UK, Central America, Mexico, and we have 14 field offices across the US. Importantly, our models across the world are adopted from our US pro bono model. Something that I think makes Kind really special is that we look at the needs of the whole child and provide trauma-informed social services, policy work, advocacy, and global reintegration efforts because children's needs extend far beyond a courtroom. The broader approach is essential as current federal policies are actively creating despair, detention fatigue, and fear, which children are being pressured to act upon by accepting self-deportation incentives. Our global programs here at Kind, we also work on root causes forcing children to migrate, violence, exploitation, impunity, and very deep poverty. We maintain a child migrant return and reintegration program, working with civil society in Guatemala and Honduras to ensure children who do return can do so safely, voluntarily, and with support. And this is an overview of our policy advocacy work. As I mentioned, our big goal is to educate decision makers, advance protections, and promote action. Here are some of our initiatives at Kind. Um, Importantly, some of these measures are already being dismantled or harmed by the Trump administration. For example, our family separation response, addressing the crisis caused by the prior administration's zero tolerance policy. That initiative has been dismantled very severely by the Trump administration. The Central American Minors Program provides free assistance to parents and legal guardians in the U.S. seeking to bring their children to the country. Unfortunately, that legal program has also been attacked by the Trump administration during its first year. We also have the Child Migrant Return and Reintegration Project that I mentioned before. And we also have our Gender and Migration Initiative, working towards preventing and addressing sexual and gender-based violence against migrant children. The family separation work, as many of you know, has been quite a vocal uh, feature of Trump 1.0, if you have it, the zero tolerance policy. Unfortunately, now we're seeing how these impacts are affecting children in the United States in a totally different context, as images across your screen are filled with kids being separated from their families, parents living in this country for more than 20 years. All of these impacts have had a terrible impact on children, and we're watching and advocating for kids in this context as well. And finally, our impact. In addition to the numbers you see here, it's important to note that our work across the country, across the world, is also making a huge impact. More than 78,000 kids have been educated on their legal rights in the US and Mexico by Kind. 30,000 plus children and families in the US and Mexico have been provided with psychosocial support. 17,000 plus children have received legal representation in the US in collaboration with our 800 plus global partners. And we have 10,000 plus children assisted with legal services support in Europe in collaboration with our partners. So let's get into the journey. Now that you have an overview of what Kind does, it's important to share what children are going through. What is it that is making them come to America? Children flee due to gang violence, forced recruitment, abuse, neglect, trafficking, and extreme poverty, and to also reunify with family. These conditions are well documented across Northern Triangle countries and beyond. I'll share with you some stories from our clients. We've changed their name to protect their identity. In this case, Leandro fled to the U.S. when he was 15 years old after being threatened and extorted by gangs and the police in El Salvador. K.I.N.D fought for his asylum case and successfully helped him gain U.S. protection. Leandro went on to take college courses and enlisted with the U.S. Marines. He shared, I want to show that people who come to the U.S. from other countries come here to succeed and do good and help others. Or take the case of Alex. Alex had to flee El Salvador due to life-threatening gang violence when he was only 13 years old. He fought for his life during the 3-month journey to the U.S., found his parents, and worked hard to get an education in the U.S. Now, Alex is safe in the U.S. and has legal protection. He is pursuing his finance degree and has had an internship with J.P. Morgan and Chase. I decided to pursue a career in finance and joined a 1-year program called Year Up. This amazing opportunity will help me pursue higher education, advance my studies, grow my career, myself, and achieve goals that I have set for myself, goals which will change my life and my whole family. Importantly, what happens at the border? I want to share with you some key numbers that we've seen across the years. You'll see that encounters of unaccompanied children have remained elevated since 2021, with fiscal year 2022 peaking above 149,000. However, by fiscal year 23, we begin to see a decline of approximately 138,000 arrivals. And at the close of fiscal year 2025, we see a historic low of approximately 30,000 kids coming to the United States. A lot of this can be attributed to Trump's zero tolerance at the border. The border has been effectively closed. There's also a lot of volatile situations going on across different countries that also impact kids' ability or decision making when it comes to coming to the United States. But no matter what might be going on, it's important to note that this really is a historic low in terms of the number of unaccompanied children arriving at the U.S. border. I also want to share with you movement of unaccompanied kids in the U.S. Here we'll start at the border. In this example, we're at the southern tip of Texas, in Hidalgo, Texas, just as an example, where a child, unaccompanied child, more than likely presents themselves before CBP agents at the border, and they're placed into deportation legal proceedings. They often travel to different ORR shelters across the country. In this case, for this example, we'll show you how a child is then transferred from the southern tip of Texas to the westernmost tip here in El Paso, Texas, where I'm based, where they're admitted into care of ORR custody. That's the Office of Refugee and Resettlement. And so this is the location where you hear children are detained. Here we have lawyers that are working diligently to help children in immigration proceedings and to reunify with their families across the country. Of course, all of this is a perfect model, right, before so many of the policies that I'll go over have been dismantled. Then ideally from here, they're released to a sponsor. In this case, they're off to California and Oakland. The child enrolls and attends school at Oakland Unified International High School. In this case, they may move to Los Angeles and there attend school at Canoga High School. So, this is an example of one of our kids here at Kind and the kind of movement and the processes that take place for them to successfully integrate and be part of our communities. Um, Importantly, I want to share with you the timeline. This is what I've been sort of hinting at throughout my presentation. Kind just released a timeline that I'll share with you in the chat in just a second, detailing how the current administration is rolling back protections for unaccompanied children, undermining safeguards and key protections. Um, this has been a historic time for Kind when it comes to these sorts of changes. And so we've actually been quite deliberate in being very detailed, going by month of 2025, really breaking down how changes in policies have impacted children across the country. So I really do hope you'll indulge us and take a look at this timeline. And unfortunately, the harms continue, so we're constantly updating our work. And we're also featuring spotlights of how certain impacts are how certain changes in policy are impacting our kids here at Kind. So I think those spotlights are also really worth um, putting a more closer attention to in order to see the real harms taking effect. So one big bucket here that we want to put attention to is eliminating legal pathways and support systems. So under the law, unaccompanied children are exempt from expedited removal. So that means that when they come into the country, they are not going to be expeditiously deported. Instead, they'll get an initial non-adversarial asylum interview with USCIS. That's one of our key agencies, even if they're in removal proceedings. These are critical protections that are being eroded by Trump's policies and practices. DHS has launched a new initiative offering $2,500 to UCs or unaccompanied children who are 14 years and older. They're in ORR custody and accept voluntary departure. This is being framed by the Trump administration as reintegration support. Even with recent narrowing, the design and messaging of these sorts of stipends are coercive for detained kids, skewing life-altering legal choices. Kids are being asked to sign declarations stating that if they re-enter illegally again, they may face penalties and must repay the stipend, language that miscasts seeking asylum as illegal, which we all know is not the case. Asylum is a lawful right at or between ports of entry. The program directs funds to a designated adult in the country of origin without guardrails to ensure the money benefits the child and doesn't increase exploitation. And because we don't have a designated adult, because we don't have those built-in guardrails, our concern is that this will increase exploitation or trafficking risks. For example, a trafficker, a criminal could force an unaccompanied child to go through these processes, get detained here in the United States, with no real intention to go back to their family, to seek safety in the country, but instead to get a stipend like this, then be deported back to their country of origin. This is the kind of exploitation and trafficking risk that we're really concerned about. And this is just a great example of how when you see these sorts of policies in the news, how they really impact vulnerable children that are being faced with these life-altering consequences, mainly because many children don't understand the consequences of voluntary departure, especially when what they're experiencing is trauma and detention fatigue. And many don't yet even have attorneys to really go over these coercive schemes that the Trump administration is putting in place. Um, The second bucket that I'd like to go over with you all is breaking the protection system at the border. The government is creating new documentation and income hurdles that operate like immigration status screens for sponsors, prolonging custody and delaying or denying release to parents or caregivers. So, in our last slide, I mentioned detention fatigue. This was never such an urgent issue that unaccompanied children had to deal with until this past year when the Trump administration created significant hurdles for sponsors to sponsor unaccompanied children so they can leave detention and they can reunify and really begin that healing process. This also erodes the law's least restrictive setting and family reunification goals. So this least restrictive setting
Is
is
this what we're supposed to do with it?
it comes from the law to ensure that children are not uh, placed in detention for a long time, that as the title says, they're placed in the least restrictive setting with the ultimate goal to reunify with their families. Case law and subsequent rules set minimum child welfare standards and prefer release to appropriate caregivers, recognizing that detention harms children.
Linda, I'm going to interrupt you. Can you please, everyone, please mute your microphones?
Tony, you should be able to mute them
I,
from
I'm trying to, and I don't see the person on here.
his iPhone.
Maybe it's a phone.
Can you please mute your microphone if you are on this? I got it. Okay. Linda, I'm so sorry. Carry
No
on.
problem. Um, and the third bucket, expanding surveillance and criminalization. I think this is what many of you are privy to now, right? As you're watching the horrific news unfold. For one, the government has expanded information sharing between ORR and DHS about children and their families. So I'll give you an example. In I think it was late fall in November, you might remember an incident in Chicago where ICE ran into a child daycare center to try and detain and question one of the workers there. This is really appalling for us because of the protected areas memos. So we had a long-standing understanding that there would be no ICE enforcement activity in areas where children congregate. That includes schools, hospitals, courts, courtrooms, also daycare centers, right? If there's kiddos there, we don't want ICE enforcement. And that has just been a longstanding sort of understanding. It was memorialized in a memo. The Trump administration immediately rescinded that memo in early 2025. And so we've really been holding our breath for months, wondering when is it that ICE will encroach? When will they enter these sensitive locations? And so that was the moment when ICE entered the center where, very infants and children are left alone at these daycare centers where parents trust that they'll be in safety. And instead, ICE had one of their operations there. What was interesting about that situation, as we learned more, is that ICE was actually attempting to detain the specific worker after being tipped off and through this information that they received from ORR, they were able to learn about every single sponsor, who they're sponsoring, what kids they're connecting with. It might be an aunt, for example, who's sponsoring her nephew who is in ORR shelter. Well, the Department of Homeland Security found out that person's information and went after them. So if you can just imagine the kind of chilling effect this will have on families. And when we go back to that slide that I showed you of of border crossings, this, if you might imagine, this might certainly be a factor that has a huge chilling effect on families, and it could deter them from even seeking the ability to sponsor kids. So this kind of surveillance and information sharing is very disturbing and has long-term consequences in ways that we could not even fathom, right? How could you have imagined that this information sharing would have resulted in a situation where ICE is actually entering a daycare center in Chicago? We're also seeing enforcement actions at schools, health centers, and courts, places that should be safe for children. In Minneapolis, public schools closed after agents tackled and handcuffed students near dismissal. Two fatal shootings by federal agents in the city have since intensified community fear. In Portland, agents detained a family in a hospital parking lot while they sought care for their 7-year-old. We've been tipped off by another member of Congress who reached out to us, similar situation. Family is driving to the hospital. Their 3-year-old has a fever, and now they're stopped by ICE. And the father, mother, and child were all detained and sent to family detention in Dilley in Texas. So these sorts of ramped up enforcement actions are just devastating when it comes to how it's impacting children. Finally, restricting humanitarian relief and increasing hardship for kids. These are efforts to remove protections, imposing soaring fees on humanitarian applications. Collectively, these shifts are creating profound fear and uncertainty, especially for children in custody. Detention fatigue and despair are real. And against that backdrop, a cash for departure offer can't be called voluntary in any meaningful sense. So these are all of the horrors, but what can we do? What connections can we make in our own community? Local leaders can and must fill gaps. This is about preserving child's safety, due process, and community trust, regardless of federal swings. So if anything, I think this moment tells us that really we have a lot of agency within our communities to try and correct some of these wrongs. So what does that look like? These are things that local governments can do and civil society must do to help protect kids. So state and municipal actors can provide stabilizing infrastructure and invest in legal services and removal defense capacity with dedicated funding for unaccompanied children representation and social services navigation. So that looks like more local legal services funding. That also looks like language access and trauma-informed protocols for schools, for libraries, first responders, and public hospitals. If we have immigrant families from all across the country going to our hospitals, we want them to see in their language what their rights are while they're trying to seek urgent care, as an example. We also want to pass and enforce sensitive location protections in schools, health facilities, shelters, and courthouses. Several city and state models do exist, and Congress should also codify this nationally. So when I mentioned that the Trump administration rescinded this memo in 2025, well, Congress can certainly has the key to bring those protections back. There's currently a bill being pushed in Congress by advocates to bring those protections back to sensitive locations. But we are also, like I mentioned, seeing more cities and state models doing the same, where states are saying, you know what, if the federal government can't do it, we're going to set a new ceiling in our country to ensure that every child, every family living in our state is safe. So there's definitely solutions there at the state level. When it comes to more strategies, it's important to document harms from enforcement sensitive locations. So if you're around any of these areas, around schools, hospitals, just in general. But when it comes to sensitive locations, it's really important for us to keep putting pressure on elected officials to make these spaces safe again. So if you're dropping off your kiddos and you see intimidating behavior by law enforcement, for example, if you're picking up your grandkids, even if you're just strolling around the neighborhood and you're passing by a bus stop and you see ice there, it's really important for you to document those harms and connect those dots with your elected officials so that they know what's going on in their community. Also connect with local nonprofits in your area and learn how you can distribute Know Your Rights materials through schools and clinics. Provide language access assistance to families or help escort children to school. You can also advocate at every level against policies that delay release from ORR, expand surveillance, or criminalize families coming forward as sponsors. Local leaders can also ensure children have access to school, job training, and community programs, wraparound integration services informed by child protection experts. Finally, on the heels of devastating DHS shootings in Minnesota, and as the Senate takes up DHS spending, K.I.N.D urges Congress to enact meaningful reforms to protect children. In other words, Congress must rein in ICE by prohibiting enforcement at or near sensitive locations, by bolstering and codifying parental right protections when a parent is detained, by preventing unnecessary traumatic family separations and enforcement, and restore and fund legal representation for unaccompanied children, maintain deferred action and other legal pathways for unaccompanied children, and reject these cash for departure for children. So really, if there's any kind of takeaway from this presentation, it's really to not feel defeated in this moment, but to really wrap your mind around the reality that while a lot of what's going on around our country is nonsensical and cruel and very disturbing, you also have a lot of agency in your own communities to try and rectify these harms. And like I said, in other states that are doing it right, when we see that the federal government sets a very low bar, to instead say, well, we're going to raise that bar here in our cities, in our communities, in our states. So, with that, that's my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions or hear any concerns that you might all be experiencing.
Linda, first of all, thank you. That was phenomenal. Um, Disheartening, but there is hope that there are agencies working so hard for these kids. I have several questions, and I know Liam Conejo Ramos's name has already come up in the chat box. But I kind of want to go back a little bit. First of all, how young do you see children coming to the border unaccompanied?
Yeah, that sometimes it's at toddler age. So it could be as young as 3. Usually when you have infants, we'll see mom coming in with their child, so they won't be unaccompanied. But these kids can be pretty young sometimes, unfortunately.
And what is the time frame when you showed on that map, when they enter the country to being detained in ORR? What does that time frame look like for a minor?
Before Trump, it was quite expeditious. I would say, gosh, not even more than 2 months, maybe, would a child be stuck in ORR shelter or in detention. But now, in the case of our field offices, in New York City, for example, we have kids that have been detained all year. So it has had a dramatic shift in how kids are being detained.
And if they come, I know you deal mostly with unaccompanied minors, but if they come with families, are they kept together or are children separated when it comes to detention?
Yeah, when it comes to family units, that's kind of tough. So if it's a mom and dad scenario, what we usually see is that a parent stays with the child and another parent is detained. If it's a mother and a child, that they'll likely either, well, this was before Trump, they would likely be released into the country, but now they're being funneled into family detention, which has really been revived at a very dramatic pace by the Trump administration.
And then as far as older children, you talked about trafficking, and obviously that is an enormous issue. Do you ever see older kids who are maybe not 18? Are we seeing them being deported back to country of origin, or even worse, a country that is not of their origin? Or are children, every child under 18 is kept in the country?
Yes, I think, what you're also kind of alluding to is an age out. So this is a situation where we've got a 17-year-old who's in detention and let's say in 3 weeks turns 18. It has been longstanding policy that that person would still be treated as a child. There have been efforts, however, by the Trump administration to also cause a chilling effect in that sector as well, and say that when kids turn 18, even if they're in ORR custody, they will be transferred to ICE adult detention. Luckily, we've been challenging that in the courts, and that has not been the case, but we're still very vigilant of the matter to see if anything, if there's any changes through the cracks, if, for example, officials are not following the law. That's something that we're looking at very closely when it comes to detention practices.
Um, I do want to talk, one of the questions in the chat pertains to Liam Conejo Ramos, which is the 5-year-old that was recently detained in Minnesota and is now being held in Texas with his father. Can you talk a little bit about that case? You may not know much, but I know he weighs heavy on a lot of people's minds, and what are next steps for this young child and his family?
Yeah. Um, Well, first, I can kind of give you a sense of what the solution could be, um, when we're operating under this guise, right? Like if we want to live in a world where people with no criminal record, for example, are not even detained. They're not even listed as a priority for ICE enforcement. So, that's kind of the standard here, and that's not what we're getting from the Trump administration. But in this imperfect world, what can we do to protect parents when they're in these really scary situations? So in this case, it's pretty clear that he was used as bait by ICE agents. There's been other sort of renditions from ICE and DHS about the situation, but no matter how you look at it, this child was very much treated as bait to get the father ultimately detained. The policy solution that we're looking at is the ICE parental directive. So this directive has been a directive to ICE for years. And the Trump administration has not rescinded that directive, but there's really no teeth to it. And so, really, what that directive says is if you're going to detain a parent and you have a child, you need to exhaust all efforts, right? If you have made that crushing determination, ICE, that you are nevertheless going to separate this father from his 5-year-old son, who's next in line? Can you call mom? Can you leave this child with grandma? Are there any other guardians that can take this child? So that is what the parental directive says. It was not followed in this case, and instead, Liam was detained with his father. We have members of Congress that have visited. I know that Representative Joaquin Castro was there today visiting the child. There's a photo if you want to look at Representative Castro's timeline or Instagram, I think it was where I saw it, and the child looks very feeble and scared. It's a scary situation. Also, people in Dili have been protesting this past weekend. They're outraged that Liam is even there. And so there's stories coming out from lawyers that were visiting their clients over the weekend at that and that were kicked out. And that's because so many families were rioting. They were outraged that this incident even happened. So there's a lot of attention being placed on family detention, but honestly, we're really concerned about how the Trump administration can disregard all of this and have even more cruel initiatives when it comes to family detention. So, something that we saw in the past was MPP. I don't know if some of you might remember that, where asylum seekers were forced to wait for their asylum proceedings from Mexico. So they would live in Mexico, go to court, then go back to Mexico. A concern of ours is, what is the Trump administration going to do with this captive population? Will they send them to MPP? For the Trump administration, the less uh, people that are before your screens, the less harm that you know of, the better it is for them to continue this cruel apparatus. So something that was very hard for us here on the border when it came to MPP is that it was sort of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of folks. And so we want to make sure that that does not happen in the context of family detention, but there are a lot of concerns that this is only going to be heightened. What will happen to families in detention? Will they stay in Dili? What are the conditions there? We're hearing they're not good already. So, for us, it's really important that you put pressure on your elected officials to make those visits to Dili, and to ensure that this does not happen to kids in your community, right? So really looking at those additional protections that can take place. There's also efforts by other Texas groups here in the state, and across the country that we're seeing. We're seeing this also in Minnesota, where kids are making like origami figurines for Liam and sending that to him in detention. Um, so he knows that he's not forgotten, that so many of us are remembering him and so many of us are outraged by it. So there's also, those sorts of efforts that you could make to make the family and families in Dili detention know that you're thinking about them. So put the pressure on Congress and really do what you can to make sure that these harms don't come to your community. And if they do, that there's community readiness. It's really important that agencies connect with each other, that child welfare agencies are notified, that your police is trained. So, I mentioned this as an ICE parental directive, but all police, all sheriffs should know, when I've got an adult and a child in my custody and I'm going to detain this adult, what am I going to do with this child? So, but the buck doesn't stop with ICE. It really behooves us to ensure that all law enforcement treats kids humanely.
Well, and I would argue, aside from the peaceful protesting, continue to film these atrocities. We had the ACLU on here recently, and they said document, document, document. I don't know that any of us would know about Liam had not there been this picture that had gone viral of this little boy in a bunny hat and Spider-Man backpack. So, thank goodness for that. I'm going to go into the chat here. Does Kind have resources and models for putting a community plan together?
Yes, that's something that I'm exploring. My role as the VP of State and Local Advocacy is to look at best models. And so that's something that I'm actively putting together myself. It's kind of a work in progress. But that's something that I really do hope to release as we come forward with that. But what we're seeing is that it's everyone's under a crisis. We're all operating under different crises. So there are, for example, advocates that are just looking at the protected areas memo. And so they're developing best practices. What are we seeing what are the best models that we're seeing from states that are helping the situation, right? Because you can look at the flip side, where there might be legislation that is way too onerous, that puts a lot of stress on a mom and pop daycare center when it comes to keeping their spaces safe and protected, to the point where they might even discriminate against immigrant kids and say, you know what, we just don't want the liability. So it's a difficult thing. Even some good intention laws end up having some negative consequences. So that's why it's a work in progress. But we're definitely working on that.
Great. Um, are unaccompanied minors with sponsors protected from additional detention?
Are unaccompanied minors with sponsors, I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Protected from additional detention. Kathy Ebersberger, can you maybe expound on that question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if they're being actively detained. Like, I understand they get detained at the first, then they go
Mhm.
to ORR, and then they get a sponsor, but are they being re-detained now with this new increase in immigration enforcement?
Yes, and those are measures we're seeing across the country. It's impacted the majority of our field offices across the country. So what happens is that when you're an accompanied child, um, if the state laws are in line, you really do have a direct pathway to eventually obtain citizenship in this country. However, there's long wait times to secure this status. So that's called SIJ status, Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. So because of this long wait period for kids to be able to secure this status, to get on that pathway for citizenship, there's something called deferred action. So what that says is this child could get SIJ status tomorrow, but because of the waiting time, they're not able to. However, we are going to defer any sort of enforcement action against this child. So that means this child is not in any way going to be seen as an enforcement priority for law enforcement. We saw that the Trump administration has attempted to end deferred action. They've attempted to undermine SIJ status in general. And so what that has done is created a lot of chaos where ICE officers will think that's not a thing anymore, even though it's being litigated in courts, and will nevertheless detain our clients. And so what is even more horrific, right, is not only this an unlawful detention, not only is it against standing law and policy, but that when that person is actually detained illegally, they're detained for months. Immigration judges are not releasing them. ICE is not releasing them, even though we tell them this is an error. You have no basis to even try and deport this child. It's getting to the point where every time we have these sorts of cases, we need to seek habeas. So we need to connect with pro bonos in our community to take this to the federal level to get this child's release. So it's taking Herculean efforts just to get children out of detention for illegal detentions, period. This should have been a no-brainer any other time.
Do you have access to the OR, the children? Do you see the conditions of their detention centers?
We do, and we also connect with advocates who also go to centers. So we operate in detention centers. Our main operations are in New York City and in Connecticut. But here in El Paso, for example, a few weeks ago, I was meeting with some pediatricians who were visiting detention centers in general in El Paso to see how kids are doing. resoundingly, children are experiencing a lot of trauma, a lot of harm. They're experiencing extreme levels of detention fatigue. They did not think that they would be spending Christmas, their birthday, their families, all of these important milestones they're missing and they're alone. Um, and so a lot of these children are really going through some deep emotional harm because of this detention. I think, the bright spot is that, even from this report and these meetings that I've had, is that a lot of people at these ORR shelters are absolutely gutted by the way that kids are being treated. And so now what would have been perhaps like a 2-month relationship is now an 8-month relationship. They knew these kids from the back of their hands. They're very well acquainted with these kids. They really care very deeply about the kids that are being detained. I'll give you an example. You might have seen this over the summer of a plane that departed America with a bunch of unaccompanied children. This was the Trump administration's effort to just get rid of unaccompanied children, despite all of these safeguards that I discussed with you today. And so when I connected with these pediatricians who were visiting them, they told me that so many of people in the shelter had become aware that these kids were going to be placed on overnight flights, and they had cooks coming in, checking back in. They left their homes. They went back to work. They made kids food. They made them sandwiches. They're just doing, whatever they can to express, some sense of humanity to children who are being treated so cruelly. So, there's also still a lot of kindness that's coming forth, but it's a difficult, really difficult situation for them.
What about counseling? Are they offered any kind of counseling?
Yeah, what we're seeing is that the counseling, it I mean, kids are needing sustained counseling at this point, right, in detention. And so detention is not meant to be this permanent state, this permanent status for kids. So there will be, occasional visits. In some extreme circumstances, kids might be transferred to a rehabilitation center, for example. But kids aren't really getting the dedicated kind of counseling that they need at this point. And at the end of the day, kids would rather be with their families in the country than an hour of counseling with a therapist, right? So there's also that reality, right? Detention was never meant to be permanent either. But when you think about it, we think about counseling, we also think about access to education. Their education has been seriously disrupted now. They're going on months in detention. So that is also taking a huge hit.
Another question from the chat. Does ICE go into ORR facilities and promote self-detention with the payments? How are they communicating with the unaccompanied minors other than publicity or newspapers? Are
It's
other forms of coercion being used on unaccompanied minors?
it's
Yeah.
deportation, not detention, sorry.
Oh, could you rephrase the question then in the context you meant?
Yeah, do they go into ORR and coerce people for self-deportation?
Oh, yeah. So that was what I had mentioned earlier. First, there's these agreements, right, where they're sharing confidential information now. So the Department of the Department of Homeland Security is going to these ORR shelters and telling people, "Hey, you got to share your records. You have to share this information." And a lot of these people are up against a wall and are sharing this information with DHS. When it comes to involuntary deportation, that's what I had mentioned earlier in my presentation about these $2,500 stipends that are being presented to children. So the Trump administration is saying, hey, kids, if you're tired of this place and you want to go back home, we're going to help you get there. We're going to give you a check of $2,500. We're going to send it to, Miguel in El Salvador. He'll be there. and you're free to go. So that'll help you reintegrate back into your home country. This is very egregious. Like I mentioned, they will likely not even have an attorney at this stage. They don't know what voluntary departure means. They don't know the consequences. The Department of Homeland Security has not ensured that the person receiving this money will in fact give that money to the child. And like I said, that also exacerbates our concerns about trafficking and exploitation. So if more criminals or traffickers know, hey, if I just send this kid over, coerce him to go to detention, make him sign this document, he's going to get $2,500. So I'm going to make 2,500 off of these five kids. You know what I mean? Now it becomes a part of another scheme where people exploit very vulnerable children. So this is an example of how the US government continues to cause harm to some of the most vulnerable kids in the world, really.
So I was asking though, how do they make contact with the kids? Do they go into the
Yes.
OR facility and individually say, hey, this kid, or do they make a big presentation, or like how do they present it? You know?
Yeah. So they become aware of any child who may be seeking voluntary deportation.
Yeah.
And so that is what signals to DHS to approach that child and make that offer. ORR is also supposed to let the child know once you want this option, this is what can happen, and you're entitled to this money. But importantly, to your question of how do these kids get this information? Is also by word of mouth. They might have just heard by someone that if you say you're tired of being here, you can just leave. So, kids aren't in some sort of vacuum where it's like, okay, these are the kids that want to go and you kids don't talk to these kids. So now it becomes a situation of a lot of misinformation. And you're really dangling this option for kids that feel really distraught about this prolonged detention that they're experiencing.
But as far as the government's concerned, they only talk to the kids that already asked for voluntary deportation. They
As
don't.
far as they're concerned, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Linda, and I'm sure I already know the answer to this, but is there any follow-up or tracking of these kids that are deported? Are there, I mean, do we know what happens? Are they just dropped off at the border? What happens for these kids who say, okay, I'll take the $2,500?
No, there's no tracking. There's no, the government is doing none of that type of work. Like I said, they're not even trying to make sure that they actually get this money in the first place. And I think what you're going to goes to a deeper concern of ours when it comes to documenting the harms. So you look at that ICE parental directive that I mentioned earlier, right, where ICE is meant to look at a parent with the child and exhaust all efforts to make sure that this child is with, a guardian and not mixed up in this detention and deportation scheme. But something that we also want to know is, did you follow those protocols? And for those parents who were deported without those protocols being followed, is there any way that we can rectify these harms, right? So a lot of us are already in the space of like, how do you remedy? How do you rectify? How do we bring these parents back to the US? And that's the biggest problem, is that there is no clear documentation, right? And so if you remember zero tolerance, the government was not even documenting who the kids were that they were separating from their parents, or what their name was, or where are they at what shelter. So if we didn't get that at that stage of encounter, we're definitely not getting that level of accountability from the Trump administration this go round.
Do you have any sense of what percentage of kids truly end up back with their families?
When they're sent back,
Yeah.
well,
Or yeah,
they might not even have families. I think that's
sure.
also important to know, right? Like may have mom in Connecticut and grandma has always been their caretaker and they're 15 and grandma died. And so now they have no one. So they're trying to get back to mom in the United States. So I think that's also, a huge concern for us is, don't forget what was the premise of them leaving in the first place.
Right. Has Kind recommended policy changes to Congress to be put in government funding packing coming up and Friday?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, you'll see I shared a link below of our statement where we're calling for Congress to rein in DHS and ICE and these tactics. We're also in a difficult situation because we don't want to say, yes, fund DHS, but, right, like we don't want to be in a situation where we're tolerating even more money being sent to the Department of Homeland Security. And so we are, giving those sorts of suggestions. We are supporting bills like the Protected Areas bill that codifies these sorts of protections. And we are constantly alerting Congress about harms so that they understand how these policies are impacting our clients and our families. So they see us as a trusted source. We're giving them information now about how to question the Department of Homeland Security, how to bring in more accountability into these situations, how to bring in more oversight. So that is a huge, huge commitment on our part to ensure that we continue looking at the situation and being a soundboard for members of Congress, and also hopefully guiding them to ways to remedy these harms down the line. But you got to vote.
You have to vote and you have to call your elected representatives, write them, call them, all of that. This is a really long question from the chat. What do we say to those who think that seeing a drop of unaccompanied children at the border from a peak of 160,000 in the Biden years to 60,000 in 2025 is a position because kids should not be, or is a positive because kids should not be traveling alone to this country? In other words, thinking that this is providing safety for kids, not harming them.
Mhm. Um, well, I mean, I can talk to you on a personal level about what it means to be an American, and what this democracy means. Um, Much of my legal career, I focused on representing asylum seekers from all over the world. And the bulk of my work was in detention. And so I would meet the most beautiful people across the world who were fighting for political freedoms, freedom of speech, who were being persecuted, who were women that were mutilated in Somalia, undergoing female genital mutilation, who were activists, who were kids that were forced to become child soldiers. All of these people that I represented and who won their asylum claims, which are really hard to win, um, believed in America more than many Americans believe in America today. And so it really is immigrants that make this country so great. It really is immigrants that make the concept of democracy and freedom so urgent. And it was really a privilege for me to represent them and to be their person because I felt that I was giving them the most powerful access that anybody could give them, which is an ability to make this country even better than before they came, to recreate their lives, to put all of that faith that they were hoping to put in their countries and to invest here in America, because in America, that's where those freedoms really reign high. So that's my perspective as a call me a romantic. I still am a romantic, even, as an immigration lawyer in El Paso, Texas. So call me a romantic, but also look at the data, look at the economy. There's numbers coming out today, right, that talk about the sharp population decline that our country is experiencing. We're already getting devastating information about how economies are being hurt. The number one entrepreneurs in America are immigrants. They're not US citizens, right? And so there's also a lot of other harms when we see these kinds of declines in movement of free people. So the solution is not this. The solution is not to terrorize and make vulnerable people even more vulnerable or subject to even greater exploitation, like the examples that I gave you. The goal is to really understand what democracy means and to ensure that we protect it for ourselves, but that we also protect it for the most vulnerable people in the world who it may not be today, but really do aspire for the democracy that made our country so great. So that was my effort, Shauna.
I think it's a wonderful answer. Absolutely. Beth DeHaven, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I just actually wanted to clarify. I had asked that question, and I love your answer, by the way, Linda. Thank you for all that you're doing for migrant children and your organization. And I truly um, do support what you're saying about immigration being something we desperately need more of, not less of. But I guess my main part of my question that I asked um, is that with this larger number of children coming in during the Biden years, were they being helped sufficiently? Because I think that is a lot of people were thinking our country was overwhelmed with too many people coming in at that time, and that we had so many unaccompanied children. So were we able to help that many children? And do you feel that do we have data to support that says, hey, we helped all these children. We didn't have to worry about that many coming in.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that is also in the impact that I shared with you about the kids that we were able to support, right? And even the numbers, right? I think it's 100% of kids that go to court with a lawyer are victorious in court proceedings. When you look at an organization like Kind that looks at a child as the whole child, right? That our representation, our advocacy does not stop in the courtroom, but it goes beyond in policy, in psychosocial, in emotional healing. We do it all. So these kids certainly don't become a charge to the community. You can even look at the examples I gave in my presentation of those types of success stories, because these kids will be able to work lawfully. These kids will access our school system. And that's the kind of success that we always see with the children that we support. I will say, to your point about the numbers under the Biden administration, not for nothing, and this is not, a political statement, but the Biden administration really had a tough predicament because when they started on day one, the border was closed, right? Under Title 42, the border was sealed off under COVID and had remained closed. So really what the Biden administration was faced with was a huge population of people that were in line and waiting and had gone through all the protocols that DHS had put in place to be able to lawfully seek asylum in this country. And so it was an impossible situation for it. It's almost like the Biden administration just had to go through the process of what it is to I don't even want to say open the border, but ensure that migrants could finally seek the protections that they were entitled to. And the second thing I'll say is don't forget Governor Abbott in this equation also. He really was the most successful person when it comes to enacting immigration policy and having an impact in immigration policy under the Biden administration. And he was a governor. And that's because he employed this method of busing migrants to communities all across the country. You know that well in Colorado. And this had the effect where some communities, some families who were going to go to a different state are now being veered to a different state and are now causing this huge crisis for well-intentioned communities when it comes to resources and everything else. And so he was really the mastermind of looking at a situation that where Biden was faced with unprecedented levels of people wanting to come in that were, again, going through all the protocols to come in. He didn't just open the gate and out came all of these people and entered our cities, but they came through those protocols. But we also had a governor that was intentionally overwhelming certain cities to the point of exhaustion. And so that was very much preconceived. That is not the normal flow that we usually see of migrants into America. And I think that's what made immigration even more of a polarizing issue, right? So even friendly communities, are now seeing people homeless and thinking, well, gee, I've always said I support this, but I'm kind of feeling a little uncomfortable about this now. So it was in fact a successful strategy. And here we are, kind of seeing the logical conclusion of that.
Well, thank you. I think that really answered my question. And thank you for reminding, I think, all of us of what the situation was like when Biden took office. And it was, I had forgotten about that. There's so much comes out every day. It's hard to remember some of these things that happened way long time ago.
Of
So
course.
that's very helpful. And just thank you for this whole presentation. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Beth.
I think we have time for two more questions. Do you have time for two more questions, Linda?
Yes.
Okay, great. Does KIND have any specific bills or model legislation for states?
Yes, I think, Kathy, that goes back to the first question. So that's something that I'm actively working on as we speak. I'm looking at sanctuary bills. I'm looking at efforts to keep information confidential. So this is to the point where someone might be scared of renewing their driver's license because they're afraid that that state agency is going to share this information with DHS. So I'm looking at this from a very proactive standpoint to see what more can states do and what models, what dots do I need to connect with other states to see what's worked for them, what hasn't. So that is my active laboratory research that I'm doing at the moment that I'd be happy to share with you once I get that through.
Yeah, we have more effect with state legislation
Yes,
than federal.
exactly. Yeah, that's my point. And I think that's a very positive thing. So, even just connecting with state orgs, they may already be aware of, for example, Boston right now, Massachusetts is working on an I-9 bill. Um, some of this stuff is so pragmatic, really, where ICE is required to let an employer know. I'm going to be coming in 5 days, reviewing all of your records to make sure every single person that is employed with you can do so lawfully. And so what Massachusetts is doing and what they're advocating for as we speak is to have this bill passed that ensures that once that employer knows that, they let their employees know. I gave you an example of how deferred action is being treated, right? Like there's a lot of confusion. The Trump administration is challenging it. Now we're seeing unaccompanied kids being detained when they shouldn't be. You can only imagine the fear of an I-9 audit and ICE coming into the workplace to kind of inquire further. So if ICE is getting it wrong, if they're already detaining them, you can imagine what they're going to do when they encounter them at the workplace. So this is their ability to get everything in order, to connect with their attorney, so that they're ready, for that day and they can show that they are lawfully working in this country. So there's a bunch of really creative solutions that I'm actively kind of creating a patchwork on to really show the model legislation that states are doing.
Thank you. The last question, Linda, is from me. And I'm thinking about the two young people that you showcased at the beginning, Alex and Leandro. And I'm wondering, knowing what you know and having seen what you've seen, do you think the American dream still exists for a young immigrant?
I think it's hard. I think, there's a lot of rehabilitation that needs to happen. Um, a dream is only what we envision and what we protect and work towards. So I think there's a bigger question for Americans. I think Americans need to ask that for themselves. What is our American dream? I think immigrants know of the American dream more than Americans do. And I think that's why so much we're seeing now has been taken for granted. But I think now's a time for us as citizens to wonder, what is the American dream? And what are we willing to do to protect it and save it? And if this isn't, and to dream bigger, right? So I would say that is a challenge more so for all of us. Because a lot of very vulnerable kids are wanting to know your answer, right? What is your American dream? Is it this America now? And if it's not, how are we going to make it better?
That's a powerful way to end our presentation for sure. Thank you. I think this first came to it was put on our radar when we first saw family separation during the first Trump administration, and now we're seeing all of this happen with ICE and DHS and this most vulnerable population of immigrants. Thank you from the bottom of my heart and everyone's heart for the hard work you're doing. I can't imagine the emotional toll it must take on you. So we appreciate you, everyone. I appreciate you joining us tonight. There is a big funding bill coming through Senate very soon. Please call your local representatives. Let them know how you feel about that funding bill. But yes, everybody, thank you for being here. And Linda, truly, sincerely, thank you for your presentation tonight.
Thank you all. It was such a pleasure to be in this space with you all. You all take care. Thanks for all the hearts.
Well deserved.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.